I haven't really thought through the podcast part. We just start putting it on there and we have people on there. So there's a big gap on there.
The main purpose of the podcast is what it says right now in your about section. So the about section says building human relationships on LinkedIn. Then the content didn't match that. That's not what the content was about.
I'm so glad I'm getting this audit because I don't know anything about the podcast. So it's awesome to understand and get pointed in the right direction.
Welcome to another episode of Smarter Podcasting with me, Niall Mackay, the podcast guy. I started my first podcast as a hobby in 2019, and it quickly grew into being one of the top 10% of podcasts in the world, has been listened to on every continent, and we're about to break 100,000 downloads in the next year. From there, I lost my full-time job and I decided to take 7 Million Bikes podcasts full-time, and I now make podcasts for people around the world. We've worked with about 50 different podcasts. We've helped them reach the top of the Apple podcast chart. And our biggest focus is when we're editing a podcast to create the best sounding possible podcast that we can. So what we do is podcast audits. And today I'm excited to do an audit of a podcast that I came across on LinkedIn. Now, my guest today, he's known as the not so boring LinkedIn guy. He is a LinkedIn influencer with over 27,000 followers on LinkedIn, which blew my mind when I saw that. He is an app developer and a business coach. Now, his podcast is called The Troy Show, and it's a little bit different to a usual podcast audit because he takes his live episodes and then turns those live episodes that he records with a guest into a podcast, which I have to say is an absolutely amazing use of content. If you can repurpose your content that you're creating, that is great. And our biggest recommendation is to create a video, then change it to audio, little short form content as well. And if you can actually start with a live video, that is unbelievable. So the name of the show is The Troy Show, and I want to welcome to my show today, Troy Hipolito. Thank you very much for joining me. I love your podcast. I love your energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I am not a podcast expert. I just help people. So I'm just here to learn what you have to say. And if I can provide some value to the audience, let's do it.
So how do you become a LinkedIn influencer?
I would say I became a LinkedIn influencer through a need. So previously I had an IT company. It was ISO Interactive, and we did a lot of work for Fortune 500 companies, other companies, startups, and things like that. And we were located in Atlanta at the time. And the work dried up real quick because all the work came from other agencies. And the work they got from, they ended up cannibalizing the teams. So these Fortune 500 companies were in Georgia for tax breaks. Very corporate. They no longer needed a lot of the stuff, and they blocked me. So we were pretty much what they call blackballed from the community because we did gamification, really cool stuff, really cool apps, multi-user stuff, and just really fun stuff. And they didn't want to lose the clients they had remaining. So we figured out, so what are we going to do? And so I asked a friend and I asked another sales guy, I said, what are you guys doing for business? And he said, well, we're using LinkedIn. And I'm like, what do you mean that resume place? I'm like, how are you getting business through LinkedIn, And they told me it's really about relationship building. So right now I'm known as a not so boring LinkedIn guy. My mother's from Switzerland and my father's Asian. He's Filipino. And so before I was known as the #1 Swiss-Filipino game designer in the world. That was actually really cool because you go to a bar and that's your pickup line, but you can't translate that on LinkedIn.
So let's start with some questions about your podcast now. What equipment do you use to record?
Oh my goodness. I use a Logitech camera and a JLab microphone right here. And it's a pretty nice setup, but it's not expensive. So as far as the streaming software, we use Restream. Sometimes we use Zoom and stuff like that, but nothing too fancy. The idea is to always have a good guest, and you want to stream it live. And so a guest will have 3 or 4 channels. So they'll have a LinkedIn Live, they'll have a YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, or something like that. At least 3 or 4 channels. And if they add their 3 or 4 channels with our 3 or 4 channels, it's going out to 6 to 8 channels out at the same time. And so I wanted to get a big boost off the gate. And then afterwards, I wanted to create a podcast on it. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't really thought through the podcast part. We just start putting it on there and we have people on there. So there's a big gap on there. But my shows are all about building business, building relationships, technology related. And so I'm sneaking in the Scoop application for every guest speaker. So the last one was pretty interesting because they were going through the buyer's journey and I said, oh, use Scoop as an application for it. And it worked out really, really, really well. So
I absolutely love that. And we'll come back to what you just said there because there's a lot of great things that you said there. So we'll continue with the questions and then we'll get into the audit part of it because as I mentioned in the beginning, it is a bit of a different audit because creating a podcast is not your primary purpose. And I didn't realize it was going out to 8 different live streams, which is incredible as well.
at least, yeah. It could be, if you have 2 or 3 guest speakers at one time, think about that, So I'm trying to impact the most I can at the beginning, but what do I know?
So how do you do your editing for your podcast, only your podcast? How do you edit your podcast and get it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all of that stuff?
Oh, I don't. I just chop off the front and the end and put it out there. I'm probably gonna get a grade of less than optimal, from you on that.
Well, don't worry, we'll cover that when we get to it. So what is your podcast niche?
It's really for the entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, and people that have high value services. So a lot of times those are coaches, those are IT companies, those are business developers, people that would use a tool or a channel like LinkedIn in order to generate business.
And what makes your podcast different from the other 250,000 podcasts that are published every single week?
I have no idea. I never even thought about it. I said, if I provide content that solves a problem or that helps people, in those areas of, self-care, business generation, learning how to lessen their pain in order to go further in what they're doing, then I'm going in the right direction.
Awesome. And then it may tie into the live, but try and think of just for the podcast, what is the goal of you putting it out there as a podcast?
Another channel. So I'm all about using multiple channels in order to generate not just eyes, but to generate value to others. For example, LinkedIn is not one channel. It could be many channels. It could be your content can be a channel. Your lives can be a channel. If it goes to YouTube, all those different channels as well. If you have a LinkedIn newsletter, when you have 4 or 5, 6, 7, 800 people that register for your live, you have a bigger email list. And so, and you can DM those people. Those people actually leave comments during the live and they can go back. So you have multiple sources of individuals that are showing interest in the things that you're doing or the things that your guest speaker is doing.
I was really excited for this podcast because I'm going to learn so much from it. And I'm learning so much already that I'm going to definitely be using for 7 Million Bikes podcast. But we can talk about that after. There was a word that you mentioned there and it ties into my last question. What value do you want listeners to come away with at the end of each episode?
I was never big on people liking me, but I want them to trust me. And so trust takes a while and they may end up liking you. So no like and trust is a huge thing. So that's one thing I want to get across through the different medias, because there's a lot of people that need to find someone they can trust to solve a particular problem. And a lot of times people will say, book a meeting with me, and I may not be able to solve their issue. But I have a pretty large network, and there's a chance that I know the right person to solve the problem. For example, they're coming to me, and usually they have a LinkedIn issue, they have a problem converting or whatever, but it may not be it may not be that. That he may explain that I'm sending emails out and I'm not getting any replies. Well, that sounds like an email deliverability issue. I'm not an email expert, but I know email experts. So I can give them some clues on, hey, this sounds like the structure of how you're sending stuff out, or if you're not getting replies, these are the things to check to make sure that your email's not blacklisted, your settings are set correctly. But if you want to fix it, go to this person. So my thing is always giving the ability to provide value to others. And value is a strange word. The big problem with, say, LinkedIn and probably podcasts too, is that a lot of people want to sell. And I think that's the wrong way to do that. If you have a product, like a low cost product, that's different. But if you have a high value service, you don't sell, you have them buy. So selling is different than having someone to buy. And in order for have them to buy, you have to have that know, like, and trust factor. And so everything you say has to be spot on, it has to be true, and everything you provide has to provide a way to lessen the pain. So what's valuable to me is not important. If it's not valuable to them, they're not always in sync. So if it's not valuable to them, they don't really care, because it's not about me, it's always about them. And that's what people forget. And in order to build a relationship and providing value, that means you help them with something. Whether you make their life better, you make them laugh, you solve a particular problem, or you lower the pain in order for them to move from one step to the other. And that's the important thing that a lot of people forget. And if you cannot build a relationship in that manner, then you're never going to be successful in those high ticket services and deals and that sort of thing.
I absolutely love that. And so much of what you said there is exactly what a podcast does. And I think that it is amazing that you're taking the live streams, which will disappear because they're live, and then taking it and putting it as a podcast, which can be listened to forever, anywhere in the world. So providing that value to get people to know, like, and trust you, like, that is what a podcast does. And this is what I preach to people all the time. By having a podcast, people get to know you, they get to trust you, they get to like you. And then, by providing them the value that they need is what's going to help your podcast be successful. So there's so much of what you said there was absolutely perfect. And I love that. So let's get into, as I mentioned at the top of the show, I audit for content, for podcast quality, like audio quality. So I don't get into the content. That's not my wheelhouse. And I listen to so many different podcasts and so many different topics.
I'm going to get it right because this microphone comes from Walmart. And the Logitech camera also comes from Walmart.
No. So the quality of your equipment is actually great. That was one of the things I did notice was, and we'll talk about your guest in a minute. And even right now, I can hear it through my headphones. The microphone's great. And it's something I do. I was just talking to somebody about this yesterday, is it's not about getting expensive equipment. Everybody wants the Joe Rogan microphone, which costs like $1,000 or $600. You're really beginning to split hairs at that point. The most important part is, one, that you have a microphone, because some people don't even have one. So that's number one, you have one. Two, that you have one that is, I think from looking at yours on the video, it's a dynamic microphone. So the most important thing you want is a dynamic microphone, which only picks up the sound in front of it. A lot of people, I have no idea why, but so many blogs tell you to get the Blue Yeti microphone, which is a condenser microphone, which means it picks up the sound from the whole room. And unless you're in a sound-treated room, nobody knows this.
During this podcast, my daughter busted in the office 3 times. Did you hear that?
No, not at all.
Oh, see, I guess we got a decent microphone then.
Yeah, you got a dynamic microphone.
Oh, good. I didn't know.
And the sound is great. I can't see exactly how you've got it set up. It looks like it's a little bit far away from you. Where is the front of the
It's
microphone?
literally probably
Ah,
5 inches.
perfect. Then it's just hard to tell on the video, but it sounds like it sounds like it's great. But let's go back to the start of your podcast. So when I first opened it up, okay, the first thing I do is look at the artwork, which again, I'm not a designer, but I do know a little bit about podcast artwork. The first thing I noticed was it's great that it has a big picture of yourself, so it builds that trust. People know who exactly that they're going to be talking to. But it was really low res. I don't know if you realize that. It's kind of blurry. So it actually looks really unprofessional. You want to have like a really high res, clear picture so that people can see it immediately. So I would first of all just change out that picture. I'm sure you have loads of good headshots where it's really high, clear quality.
So you're saying the picture is low res of me?
So that's an easy fix. On the right-hand side of the artwork of the main, I kind of call it like the album artwork. Your front cover of your podcast is like your album artwork. Down the right-hand side, there was a red band, and then there was text reading vertically. It was so small that you couldn't read it anyway. And to be able to read something vertically is almost impossible. And then the really important stat, though, is that 80% of people listen to podcasts on their phone. So everything you should do, everything you design, you need to think about people are looking on a really small screen. So you should just limit the amount of text that is on there. Really, the only text that should be on there is the name of the show in big, bold letters alongside your pictures, so that anyone who's scrolling on their phone will easily be able to see what it is, because otherwise it's redundant. And that red text on the side was a bit like that.
Got it.
Now, the big thing I noticed though was the name of your show is The Troy Show, right?
Yeah, it's very original.
But the artwork says the Troy Agency, which is the name of your company, right?
Yeah, the logo, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So it didn't match. So I would have a look at, if I was going to redo the artwork, I would keep the same picture, but just have it high res. And I would have the name of the show in big, bold letters saying The Troy Show. And I don't think you need the Troy Agency, because it doesn't tell you, the Troy Agency doesn't tell you what the show is.
Yeah, I think I created that logo. When I created the Troy Agency, I created the logo in like 10 minutes. And I said, oh, that's good. And then I started using it for everything. But you're saying there should be a separation. Got it.
Just for the podcast. So when what do you use to host your podcast? Is it Buzzsprout or Spotify for podcasters or Captivate?
I don't handle that. So I just other people. So that's why I'm looking at the artwork for the live. I think may be a little different. So whenever we have a live, we create original artwork, but I hand it off to the podcast people, and it seems like they may not have been doing a great job on the artwork part. So I'm learning quite a bit,
Have a chat with them about their artwork.
Yeah, I will. Good guys, but
what I would also advise is, and I learned this from Adam Shibley, is add a tagline to the title. So if you go on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, it just says The Troy Show. Now, if anyone's scrolling through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or trying to find a business podcast or a LinkedIn podcast to listen to, just reading The Troy Show doesn't tell them anything about it. So you don't need to change your branding. You don't need to change anything at all. But on your host provider, which might be Spotify for podcasters, you can go on there and add a tagline to the title. So, for example, I would say The Troy Show, building high-value LinkedIn relationships. So that when somebody's scrolling through, they see that.
So is that tagline that you have, is it the same every time, or is it different for every podcast?
It's same every time. For your podcast, it will be the same every time. So it's basically the title of your podcast, but you don't need to change the name as you say it. You don't need to change the name on the artwork. It's just lives there so that when people come across it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, they immediately know what it's about. Because right now it just says The Troy Show. If someone sees that, they don't know what that is.
Yeah, I gotcha. Yeah, so you want a tagline on the actual podcast in general, and then the cover work is the individual titles who we're talking with and why we're talking to them. Got it.
So you can change the artwork for every episode, but I'm talking about the main album cover, like the main artwork. should just be your picture and it should just say The Troy Show. Don't add the tagline because it's too many words. The artwork is so small on phones that you just want 3 big, bold words that people can see. It's just the artwork, like the album cover, but then the title above it. If you go look on Spotify, you'll see the artwork, and then the title above it will say The Troy Show, just as an example, building high-value LinkedIn relationship.
I like that tagline. Look at that. I'm using it.
Well, I did take it from your About section. So I looked at your About section and I was like, oh, I think that would be a good one. But this is another really, really important reason why I believe you need to have a tagline, is because it's really hard to find your show. So I Googled The Troy Show, and the whole first page is about a TV show about the Battle of Troy.
Oh, my goodness.
Then when you Google The Troy Show podcast, the whole first page is other shows called The Troy Murphy Show, The Troy Farkas Show, The Troy Wolf Show, The Troy Steven Sanders Show, and The Trojan War, the podcast, and the Troy University Podcast Network. So all of these come up on the first page of Google if you Google The Troy Show podcast. So I would think about adding that tagline, because hopefully then it will come up more on Google. It took me a really long time.
Well, I'm so glad I'm getting this audit, because like I could really audit your LinkedIn profile, but I don't know anything about the podcast. So it's awesome to understand and get pointed in the right direction.
You're very welcome. That's why I do it. And it's just, I get called a podcast expert, which I find really weird and cringy kind of at first. But then I'm like, the more I do these, I'm like, oh, I guess I do know some things. And I just want to help people, because when I look at the podcast, I'm like, oh, you could change that and change that. And you don't think about Googling your own podcast. And then you start to see something different.
So is there any other SEO stuff on the back end that's important?
So I don't get too much into the SEO stuff because it's a whole minefield, and we could do a whole episode on that. And you can go back and you can find an episode I did about the truth about SEO, because I think there's a lot of untruths out there about podcast SEO. But so we can go into that on another call maybe, but that definitely does help. Now, when I looked at the About section, I thought it could be a little bit clearer. The formatting could be a little bit better about what the podcast is actually about. The formatting there was some caps in there, which was a bit weird, and it didn't exactly explain what the podcast was about. And there was no links in it as well. So we'll talk about a call to action in a minute, but I would have a call to action, which for you may be go to your LinkedIn. There wasn't even a link back to your LinkedIn profile.
Oh my goodness. I am so ashamed.
I would think about having some links in there.
I just realized I don't know what they were doing.
And then there was the same with the individual show notes for each episode. They were a little bit messy, a little bit unclear. I have a format and a template that I follow that lots of people follow for the show notes, which gives an overview of the episode. And again, it's all about value. So you want people that are scanning through Spotify to find the episode, immediately understand what the value of that episode is. I normally include the 5 key takeaways, so they will immediately be able to see what they're going to learn from that episode and be able to learn from it. I also saw, which I was really surprised at, you had no ratings on your podcast on Spotify anyway. So I would start asking for them when you're doing your lives at the end, which we'll talk about the outro as well. But you can start to ask for people to rate your podcast, and that will help with your rankings and help with your chart positions and things like that.
You know, when we created Scoop, the application, that's the first thing I did. So I said, yeah, can you just go ahead and give me? So I got like 15, 20 people gave me a 5-star rating. And we found today one was a really nasty guy. He just, it doesn't work. He gave it 1 star. I'm like, what do you mean it doesn't work? Like, what do you mean?
So I run a quiz night for fun every Tuesday night, and I just did it last night. And one of the rounds that I do is my favorite round to do. Is called 1-star reviews. And I go on things like IMDb, find the top movies of all time. These are the best movies without a doubt, like The Godfather. And you will find people who have left 1-star reviews for these masterpieces. And normally the people who leave 1-star reviews, now I'm not talking about the person that you were mentioning, I don't know the person, but normally people who take the time to leave a 1-star review are a little bit unhinged. And the
Mm.
example of that is I did a quiz round of 1-star reviews of famous attractions like the Taj Mahal, the Eiffel Tower. People go on, leave 1-star reviews. And somebody did it for the pyramids of Giza. And the reason they left a 1-star review for the pyramids of Giza was there was too much sand. So you don't need to put too much credit into those 1-star reviews because generally they're from somebody who's got way too much time.
I took it personally though. I just said, "Where is the guy? What do you mean?" But but then like the software works on is on Google, right? Or Chrome, right? So it's a Chrome extension and it's software wrapped into it. I'm thinking, did this guy try to install it in Microsoft Explorer or something? Like I think they like, well, it doesn't really, or whatever it is. And I've actually had interviews with people, and I'm maybe a little more technically inclined, but there's a huge population that can't do anything. And so the concept of a software, is very difficult for them. They can't even do a screen share, or they can't find the button for the screen share.
And that person leaves you a 1-star review.
I'm gonna find him, and I'm gonna give him some free software, change his mind somehow. I don't know how to do it yet, but you know.
All right, so let's now get into the meat of the podcast. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, you're creating live content. You're not creating a podcast. Okay, so we do have to always think about that. And it is great to repurpose the content. But what I would do, and I would recommend creating a boilerplate intro. So at the moment, you had no music, no introduction, which obviously comes because it's live, but there was 12 seconds of silence when you press play on the podcast. Then you can hear some keyboard clicking, which again is probably you starting the live or whatever it is. But I would create a boilerplate intro that can just be tacked on at the beginning of every episode that has the music, introduces yourself, introduces the podcast, introduces the episode, and then the guest, and then start the live from there.
Yeah, I could actually add that to the live. And how about an outro? You suggest now outro. If you're doing an intro, you might as well do an outro, I'm guessing.
Yeah. So I would do a boilerplate outro as well, where you ask for, followers, turn on notifications, subscribers, leave a 5-star review, and most of all, choose your call to action, whichever you want people to do. Just choose one important call to action, and then tell people to do that. So whether it's follow you or on LinkedIn or whatnot. But this was the most important thing I have to tell you, which was the worst thing about your podcast, which I don't know if you've gone back and listened to it. I don't know if it was you or your guest, but your chair was creaking the whole time.
Oh, that was I know which one it was. It was the one with Kerry. He was the business developer guy, one of my clients. He has the squeakiest chair ever. And the problem is he's deaf. So I have to put the volume. No, it's seriously, he's kind of deaf.
So loud. It was off-putting, and I eventually had to stop listening because it was because you have to remember 80% of people listen to podcasts with headphones on, they're driving, they're in the gym. So that noise is right in their ears.
It's a very high-pitched noise too, if you're sensitive to that. Yeah, I totally get it. It was only one episode though, right?
I only listened to the last episode that was published. So it was the last episode, which from May 6th. It was called Unlocking Actionable Financial Data, Custom Dashboards for CPAs and Businesses.
Yeah. That was he has a very squeaky chair. Like when we have Zoom meetings, it's like it's unbearable. Like this one's not too bad. Yeah, not squeaking.
Yours is okay. So I wasn't sure if it was you or him. It was him. So it's something to talk to your guests about. His audio wasn't great either. So I could tell right away by listening to it that you were using a microphone. He was probably just using his laptop. So you want to maybe advise your guests before they come on the live, try and get a microphone. If you don't have a microphone, wear a headset. If you don't have a headset, wear AirPods. Even like a cheap microphone that's built into your headset will be better than your laptop microphone. So try and give them a bit of advice on that. Be somewhere quiet. Don't be in a squeaky chair. It will really, really help.
I think it's because he's an older gentleman, and he's deaf, so he doesn't probably hear his own chair squeak.
Probably, yeah. But the most important thing is, and this is what we do, is the post-production. So we can take all of that out. If we were editing this podcast, We would increase the audio quality of his microphone. We would try our best to take out that squeaky noise of the chair. What we do is try and make podcasts sound as professional as they can. So even if you're doing it remotely, and we've done podcasts where there's 5 people on the panel from across the world, we'll enhance each of their microphones. And so you almost think that you're listening to a bunch of people in a studio or 2 people in a studio. So that's what we want to try and aim for. I think podcasting, everybody knows it's done remotely, especially after the pandemic. Everybody knows that podcasts are recorded over Zoom or online. There's very few that are recorded in a studio. But what we want to try and do is create a podcast that sounds so good that you think those 2 people are in the same room and that you're in the same room with them as well.
Yeah, you definitely want to equalize a lot of the sound so it doesn't sound like someone's in a hallway or whatever, you know.
And then, as I mentioned, I don't evaluate the content, but I did think it was really interesting. I think it would appeal to a lot of people. There was so much value in it as well. But if the main purpose of the podcast is what it says right now in your about section, so the about section says building human relationships on LinkedIn, then the content didn't match that. That's not what the content was about. So I would have a look at what does your about section say? What does that tagline say? And be consistent on what you deliver, because it's people are going to scroll. The number one way people find is by word of mouth or by scrolling the apps. So they're going to scroll it. They're going to find it. They're going to go, oh, this is about building LinkedIn relationships. I really want to learn about that. And then they're going to listen to it. And then they're going to be like, oh, this is not one.
So I have a few of them that are clients, and I interview them about their service. And I do bring in some relationship building conversations, but I totally understand what you're saying. You want to keep the subject matter pretty, like you said, consistent.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't need to be 100%. I think interviewing your clients is great, but try and make sure you work in that even early on in the beginning, or how did you meet that person, or how do you use LinkedIn to do that? If that's what you want the niche of the podcast to be. If you want it to be about something different, that's fine, but I would just change your about section, change the tagline, and make sure it all matches. And once you start to do that and you do it consistently, then you'll watch the podcast will grow because people will keep coming back because they want to get that value.
Makes total sense. I agree.
Now, my last point is one of the most difficult things to do, right? Now, what all podcasters do this is you invite your guest on the show, you talk to them for half an hour to an hour, you talk about their business, who they are, what they do. And then at the end of the show, everybody does this. Where can people find you? Tell people how to get in touch with you. What podcasters do when they do that is you're giving away your call to action to the guest because you're spending money and time creating a podcast to build your business. I assume in the most cases, you're creating a podcast to help your goal. And you've already given this guest an hour of free airtime. You've already given them promotion, and obviously they're helping give value to your listeners as well. One of the most difficult things at the end of the podcast is to not give them that call to action. So when I interview people for my podcast, I don't say at the end, oh, tell people where they can find you. I'm going to say to people, go and find me. This is where you can find me if you want to learn more from me. Because at the end of the day, I'm creating this podcast to build my own business. It can feel really awkward. It can feel really difficult, but I would advise not doing that, not giving your guest that call to action. Save that for yourself.
I never even thought about that. I did exactly what you said everyone does.
Yeah. But it's totally normal. I heard you do it. You're like, hey, I can't remember what his name was now, but you're like, tell people where you can find them. It's just people think it's because it's standard and it's normal and it's polite to do as well. But once you stop doing it, you'll realize that they don't really notice it. It's not impolite. It's not rude. And you've already given them an hour of free airtime as well. So you've already given that person so much value.
Yeah. And on the live streams, I should follow the same pattern. Of course, we're in the introductions. I simply ask where people are at. And if they're interested, I'll give a couple of CTAs, call to actions, and I'll have my assistant to drop it in the link. I said, yeah, if you want a meeting with her, I said, we're dropping it. And so it might be kind of weird on a podcast where you're not going to see the chat. So I don't really know how to handle. I didn't even think about handling that because usually I provide the links, and I'll have their CTA is typically a link for the newsletter or a booking link or whatever. And the slides, I end up creating a post the following day for if there were slides associated, you know. So I guess there are major differences between a regular podcast and something that's happened live.
Yeah, for sure. And I think with just a little bit of post-production, a little bit of editing, it can be tweaked. That was one thing I was going to say was in the beginning of the podcast. And again, obviously, because you're just taking the live, you referenced somebody was listening from Africa somewhere. I forgot off the top of my head. You're like, hey, how you doing? A couple of people like that. For a podcast, if I was editing it to put it out as a podcast, I would cut all that part out because when you create a podcast, again, it's a really intimate personal relationship you're creating with the listeners. It's you, the guest, and the listener, or you and the listener. They're listening on their own. Most people are listening to a podcast on their own, wherever they may be. So you want to create that relationship with them. And as soon as you start referencing somebody listening from the other side of the world, you start to kind of break that relationship because they're like, oh, he's not talking to me. He's talking to somebody somewhere else. It's a really small thing, but that's something that I would advise.
It's too much as noise for a podcast, but for a live, it's interactive. Got it.
For a live, it's perfect. But if I was editing it for a podcast, I would just cut that little bit out and we're going to create that one-on-one relationship with the listener. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is it's amazing that you're taking one piece of content, spreading it across so many different ways, so many different lives. And the fact that you're using it for a podcast is just amazing. So these are all just little things that I would advise to take it as the podcast medium to take it to the next level.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. It's very appreciative because although I post on YouTube as well, I only have 30,000 views or whatever. It's some small number. And I'm looking at this like, I get so many views on LinkedIn. Why am I not getting views on these other channels, And so, for example, if I have 400 or 500 people that register for that month, I'll have about a 35% show up rate on there. And then I'll have the ability to shoot everyone an email plus my email list. And so the number of people that actually see that on, say, for that register for 500 is usually closer to maybe 7,000 immediately. And so because of all the different things that, you can use to reach out to people. And I'm looking at some of these other channels. I'm like, well, maybe the people that are doing the YouTube management, they're just mediocre. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, they're all just different platforms. They're all different mediums. So like YouTube is very different to podcasts. Podcasts will be different to live. And so it's great to repurpose the content, but there are little things that you can do for each medium that is going to help you. I mean, YouTube, for example, you don't get much engagement on YouTube. So generally, if you get 30 to 40% engagement, you'll be doing really well. Whereas a podcast, it's going to be about 80%. And even YouTube tells you, YouTube comes up and it says that if 50% of your viewers are still watching after 30 seconds, that is typical. So YouTube, you're expected to lose 50% of your viewers in the first 30 seconds, and you're doing a good job. So YouTube is a completely different beast to podcasting and to lives.
I see. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, it's good to know, but it's also good to know that I don't want to do it. That's why we hire people. Like, you want me to get you clients through LinkedIn, then you go to my accelerator system program.
Yeah. Hello. We got someone else.
You want to go here and just say hi real quick?
Hello. I saw you on LinkedIn, actually. I was like, oh, wow, he's got a beautiful daughter. That's awesome. Well, I'll let you go, and thank you so much. If you've enjoyed this, if you've gotten value from this, if you have your own podcast, get in touch with me at 7millionbikes.com. Don't forget to follow, rate, subscribe, all of that good stuff I talked about. And the biggest thing that you can do is if you enjoyed this podcast and you got value from it, please share it with another podcaster. Please share it with someone else. And if you want to get a podcast audit as well, then get in touch with me as well. The link will be in the show notes. Troy, thank you so much. I'm excited to see the changes that are going to be made to your podcast, and hopefully we can help you with that as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It has been very helpful, and I'm sure we'll have some additional conversations soon.
Awesome. Cheers. Happy birthday and enjoy your cake.
All right. Thank you.